Hello, folks, and welcome. We'll be starting off in about a minute, just waiting for people to, you know, fill the room and join us. All right, glad to see you folks joining us for this webinar. I'm excited for what we have in store today. First of all, hello everyone. Welcome to tonight's call, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for our discussion on Canada's oil and gas emissions cap. My name is Aly Hyder Ali. I am the Oil and Gas Program Manager at Environmental Defence Canada. And for the last 2 years, I've worked on federal climate policy alongside other environmental non-for-profits, as well as grassroots organizations across Canada to hold oil and gas companies accountable for their role in climate crisis, as well as pushing for strong climate policy that reduces emissions and builds greener, healthier communities. Having worked in organizing and advocating for environmental protection, I feel very passionate about protecting our environment, along with the people and the wildlife that rely on it, not only for ourselves, but also for future generations. If you're not familiar with environmental defense, we are a leading Canadian advocacy organization that works at municipal, provincial, and federal levels to safeguard our fresh water, create livable communities, decrease Canadians' exposure to toxic chemicals, end plastic pollution, tackle climate change, and build a clean economy. I'm so very excited to welcome you all to our live talk. Uh, where do we go from here? Where we will be taking a deep dive into Canada's oil and gas emissions cap and discussing what we all can do to keep this important climate policy moving forward. Now, before we get into the webinar, I do want to acknowledge that I am calling from Ottawa, which is situated on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We extend our respect to all Indigenous peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. We acknowledge the waters, the air, the lands, and the resources that continue to create safe spaces for our gatherings, our workplaces, and our homes. And we recognize and respect the importance of Indigenous leadership in protecting and stewarding the land. Let us also keep in mind that it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. Now, with us today, we have three amazing speakers that I'm so excited to hear from, who are doing such important work across this country on advocating for strong climate action and holding big polluters accountable. Starting off, we have Alex Cool-Fergus with Climate Action Network. Alex is a political organizer and a climate policy enthusiast. She has run a dozen campaigns at federal and municipal levels and supported or led various climate justice campaigns and worked for environmental groups in Montreal, Yellowknife, Ottawa, and Gatineau. As the Climate Action Network Secretariat, Alex leads the government relations work, pushing for ambitious, robust, and inclusive domestic climate policies at the federal and subnational levels. We also have Dr. Joe Vipond, who is an emergency physician out of Alberta and is the past president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and the co-founder of Calgary Climate Hub, which has been active working on the climate crisis since learning of its dire repercussions 15 years ago. And last, but certainly not least, Gretchen Fitzgerald with Sierra Club Canada. Gretchen has been working on protecting ocean life from oil and gas drilling for over 2 decades. She has an academic background in marine biology and a passion for supporting grassroots action and collaboration to respond to the biodiversity as well as the climate crises. As part of Sierra Club Canada, she helps advance grassroots actions, unique programs, and advocacy to achieve the ambitious goals of the organization's commitment to protect our environment. I hope you all will join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists, Alex, Joe, and Gretchen. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss this important policy, the oil and gas emissions cap. Now, just as a background for the audience, for the last 2 years, people across this country have been calling on federal government to make good on its promise to limit and reduce oil and gas pollution. Last year was the hottest year on record. And in Canada, we faced a horrific year of wildfires, where more than 18 million hectares were burnt, and we experienced some of the worst air quality on this planet. Tens of thousands of families were displaced, and countless livelihoods were destroyed. What followed was a winter which wasn't much better, as Canada experienced its warmest winter ever with above normal temperatures and below normal snowpack. Now, 2024 is, expected to be worse. It's expected to be hotter, drier, and smokier than 2023. It is no doubt that climate change is here. We are facing the climate impacts, and global warming is bringing hotter and drier weather. For Canada to do its part in the global fight against climate change, it is clear that we need the oil and gas emissions cap urgently. The oil and gas industry is the largest source of pollution in Canada, accounting for 31% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. And since 1990, this industry has doubled its pollution. Without a strong oil and gas emissions cap, oil and gas pollution will continue to grow unchecked, which only serves to threaten our health, our futures, our environment, and our economy. This all brings us to today. Some of you undoubtedly may have heard about the emissions cap, but today we're going to be providing more context on why it's so essential to limit the oil and gas emissions, and to go over what is next for this key policy and how we can all keep Canada on track to meet its 2030 climate goals. We'll start off with Alex, who will talk to us about how the emissions cap can hold this industry accountable, the oil and gas industry, and what we can do to keep pushing for strong climate policy. Following Alex, Joe will be speaking to us about the health impacts of climate disasters that people in Canada are experiencing, and how wildfires are connected to climate change, and how the oil and gas industry is driving this crisis forward. Then Gretchen will provide an in-depth look from her perspective in Atlantic Canada on how the impacts and the influence of the oil and gas industry impacts the communities in Atlantic Canada. Throughout this webinar, we will be sharing ways for you to get involved and for you to learn more about this important policy. And at the end, there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask our panelists questions about what was discussed. A quick reminder, if you do want to ask questions, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. All you have to do is just hit that button, type in your questions, and our team will relay them to me, which I will share with our panelists. We do get a large volume of questions, so there's an opportunity, there's a possibility that we may not be able to answer them all, but believe us, we will be trying to get to as many as possible because we do want to answer your questions. At any time during this webinar, if you would like to turn on closed captioning, you have the option to do so in the meeting controls toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Click the CC, show captions icon, and closed captioning will turn on. We're also recording this event and posting it on YouTube as well as Facebook. So if you have to leave early, or if you found out that you learned something that you would like to share with your friends or your family, we will be circulating the recording after this webinar in an email. Now, with the housekeeping out of the way, perhaps I can call on to Alex to start the panel discussion.
Yeah, hi folks. I hope you can hear me okay. I am at a conference today, and things are really interesting, but it's also a bit noisy as people are in a reception in the room right beside me. So lovely to be on this panel and to chat about one of my favorite topics, which is the emissions cap. Ali, you want me to just jump into it?
No, we have a few questions, of course, and
Wonderful.
thank you so much for making the time. I know you're at the conference and still being able to attend because this is such an important regulation, and definitely the audience supporters are very interested in getting your perspective. We can start off with a recent report that Environment and Climate Change Canada released last week that shows that oil and gas pollution in Canada continues to increase, and is still the largest source of pollution in the country. The overall greenhouse gas emissions in Canada have also increased as well, which obviously doesn't, help with Canada doing its part in fighting climate change. It is true that Canada has a suite of climate policies that are being developed, but could you speak to what this emissions cap policy is and what it could mean for Canada's climate targets?
Yeah, absolutely. So Canada has set climate targets. They're not as ambitious as Canada should be at this time, but they are important, and Canada is on its way to achieving those targets as well, which is encouraging. Um, that being said, so according to last week's National Inventory Report, unfortunately, the oil and gas industry still continues to grow in terms of its emissions in Canada's overall emissions profile. And so now it represents 31% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the building sector, the heavy industry sector, and the electricity sectors combined. So while we see a whole bunch of other sectors reducing their emissions in very real and tangible ways, finding innovations, finding ways to meaningfully reduce their pollution, the oil and gas sector continues to grow with regards to its pollution. So, 2 years ago, as Aly said, the federal government announced this oil and gas emissions cap, which is essentially a way of uh, making the oil and gas sector put their money where their mouth is. So for years, they've been investing tons of money into these advertising campaigns that say, we're part of the solution. We want to help. We believe in net zero. We are committed to making these changes. And so what the government is doing with this emissions cap is saying, okay, then here's the limit. Here's the upper limit of where you can pollute to. It's going to start going down as of the set year. And we believe that you are able to do this through different technological advancements, through different efficiency measures, by reducing methane, for example. And these are ways that the federal government, is able to eventually limit the emissions from the oil and gas sector. So, you know, where we're at right now, unfortunately, although this is something that has been announced, that has been pushed for by a whole bunch of environmental groups and citizens such as yourselves, it's unfortunately not yet the rule of law. So this is a regulation. The regulation is not yet published. And so that's really where Ali and I and Gretchen and Joe and all of a whole bunch of folks from the environmental movement are continuing to push to hold the oil and gas sector accountable for its outsized emissions, which are really out of control and which continue to grow, unfortunately.
Yeah, and if I could just jump back into something that you mentioned, right? Like the oil and gas industry has made these public claims that they want to invest in reducing their pollution. They speak to these claims in various different ads, spend billions of dollars on these ads. But for some reason, when there is a policy like this that is, at the table, all we hear is that the oil and gas industries and their associations and the CEOs and the shareholders and the conglomerates continue pushing back against it, which of course, it's quite strange that they're asking to reduce their emissions, they want to reduce emissions, but now all of a sudden they want to stop this policy. Could you share with us today, like, what are some ways that they're actually preventing this policy from coming into effect?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of ways. As you mentioned, Ali, there are enormous amounts of money being spent on simply advertising and advertising campaigns. I live just outside of Ottawa, and in Ottawa, there's tons of ads talking about how a cap on emissions is actually a cap on productivity. There's a whole bunch of misinformation that's being generated by the oil and gas industry, and that's one way that they're scaring people off. Um, Another way that they're pushing against this policy is by lobbying. And so I know that Environmental Defense has done some really good reporting on the amount of lobbying that oil and gas industry lobbyists are doing. And so I believe that last year, so 2023, there were more than one meeting per day that were registered for the oil and gas industry with different, high-ranking government officials, with ministers' offices. And so these are very tangible ways in which they are trying to promote their own interests and the status quo unfortunately, at the expense of ordinary Canadians, ordinary people, ordinary communities, and our natural world as well. And so What's really important when we think about this oil and gas emissions cap is that we remember that although industry would prefer a status quo, the vast majority of Canadians support the oil and gas emissions cap. And in fact, in a poll that was released just a few weeks ago from Climate Action Network, we found that across the country, so no matter what part of the country you live in, and that includes Alberta, regular, everyday folks support this policy, see that there is an unfairness in the fact that every other sector is working hard to reduce their own emissions, but that the oil and gas sector continues to emit without any consequence, which is truly unfortunate and leads to catastrophic events such as the wildfires that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, it definitely sounds like they're putting their efforts in kind of distract from the progress that could be made with this policy, like the other sectors in Canada are doing when it comes to reducing their pollution. But it's also true that it has been 2 years since Prime Minister Trudeau first announced the emissions cap regulation. And last December, we did see the full framework. You alluded to this earlier. It is still not in law. It's still not in effect right now. My question to you would be then, where do we go from here? What are the next steps, and what can we all do to continue pushing this policy forward?
Yeah, so there's a lot that we can continue to do. And so many of us continue to advocate, continue to lobby. We're continuing to push every day for this essential policy to be adopted by the government. But, for, maybe my challenge that I would give to folks here on this call um, is every time that you feel the sense of climate grief or climate anger, especially when we're seeing the impacts of climate change so vividly in different communities and across the country, make that your call to take action and to demand a strong oil and gas emissions cap because politicians react when people react. And so, many of us, most of us across this country believe that the oil and gas sector has had its time, that they've emitted more than enough of their fair share, and that now is the time to cap their emissions and to hold them accountable for the pollution that they have been emitting for decades. And so, what I would ask folks to do is to call your MP, talk to your MP, send emails if you can, continue to advocate and to voice your desire to have this cap implemented as soon as possible. We know that the oil and gas industry is really hedging their bets on a conservative government being elected in the next election. That is possible. And really our safest bet to reduce emissions from the oil and gas industry is that the oil and gas emissions cap is implemented ahead of the next election. And that message needs to be heard really loudly at the federal level. So do whatever we can to make sure that our elected officials are hearing from everyday folks and not just from oily lobbyists.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Alex. And if I could just add some context, I was speaking to a retired MP. I won't say the name, but he used to be a Liberal MP. And in one of the conversations, he did mention that about a call is probably they weigh a call from a constituents about as much as 1,000 signatures on a petition. It really means a lot to them when they're hearing, directly from the voices of the people that they represent in their writing. So, I can only, echo what you said about using your power, using your voice, and engaging with these elected officials because they do want to hear from you. They do want to hear from their people that they represent. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Alex. That was definitely very interesting. I think there are steps that we can all take to counter some of the pushback that we're hearing or seeing from the oil and gas industry to ensure that this policy does come into play because it is so important. And Canada can't meet its climate targets without reducing the larger source of pollution, which is, of course, the oil and gas industry. Okay, so for those who are just joining us, we just heard from Alex Cool-Fergus with Climate Action Network. She obviously helped us explore the emissions cap policy, the impacts of these rising emissions, and how we can all collectively band together and use our power to ensure that we can counter, the lobbying and the misinformation that's coming out from the industry and their associates. Next up, we have Dr. Joe Vipond. Joe, if I could get you to turn on the camera and wave. Um, Joe, you're obviously a physician. You're Albertan. You have a unique perspective, pretty much in all conversations when it comes to speaking about climate action, climate change, and the health impacts of climate disasters. And I'd ask you to put on your physician hat for now, and if you could share with us your thoughts on what are the connections between our health, the health of communities, the wildfires that we saw last year and we're expecting to see this year, and climate change.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, for many years, the face of the climate crisis was polar bears. And, nobody drove less, nobody instituted a emissions cap because of polar bears. So even though they were cute and cuddly, it didn't really have the power, the impact that we needed it to have to create the change that we need. So recently, we've been starting to recognize that humans need to understand that this climate crisis is a health crisis and that the health that's being impacted is their own. So, I mean, there's such a huge variety of things, and we can dig into some of the specifics if you wish, but anywhere from, anybody from Ontario and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick can speak to the fact that Lyme disease is expanding and getting worse. A multiple number of increase since like over the last decade, as far as the number of illnesses that are happening from the ticks. They're spreading and they're getting more intense. We can also talk about the number of internally displaced peoples that have happened. So every time there's a flooding event, every time there's a massive storm causing sea level impacts on a community, and every time there's a fire, we have internally displaced peoples. And I don't know if people are aware, but breaking news, Fort McMurray, south part of Fort McMurray, hundreds of people have been evacuated this afternoon because of an encroaching wildfire. That's on top of the thousands of people that are currently displaced from Fort Nelson in BC. And it's like May 14th. Last year, it really only started to get really horribly worse in August. And of course, we had the evacuation of the entire city of Yellowknife. And where is this going to go? And you may say, well, what does internally displaced people have to do with health? Well, you know what? You're not super healthy if you're living in congregate living, away from your primary care, away from your general routine. And I can tell you personally, I saw multiple people in the emergency room last September due to the Yellowknife evacuation that were ill specifically because of those evacuations. And then I'll quickly touch on wildfire smoke. We've already had one smoke day here in Calgary, and I'm anticipating a very unpleasant, smoky summer. And it's not just about the anxiety that the smoke produces in my brain when I see that enveloping my city. It's also about the actual health impacts. It's essentially a form of air pollution. And just like you wouldn't want to huff the smoke from a coal-fired power plant, you don't want to be huffing the smoke from wildfires. And so as these increase, we're going to have increasing effects. And then I'll just touch on three more. Heat itself is deadly. In fact, the BC Alberta heat dome in 2021 was the deadliest weather event in Canadian history, with over 650 people killed. And that's predominantly affecting those of lower socioeconomic classes, in particular the elderly, those with mental health issues. So we're going to be seeing increasing events like that as we go forward. And finally, I'll just touch on food security. Why is food security important? Well, I really love food. I eat food almost every day. And so the prospect of having decreased amounts of food in my world in a few short years to decades is really anxiety provoking for me. And I guess that just leads us to the last thing, and the mental health impacts of eco-anxiety, eco-grief, and the post-traumatic stress disorder of being evacuated from communities.
Yeah, wow. I
I know it's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And, first of all, our thoughts, are with, the communities that just got evacuated, or the folks that just got evacuated. It is definitely scary because, in the past, conversations about climate change have always been like, oh, it's coming. But the fact is, climate change is
It's
here.
here.
It's driving these causes, these impacts on our health, and you touched on so many of them, and it does breed a little bit of that anxiety and fear within you. Um, if I could just ask a question, what are some of the communities, or who are the most vulnerable when we talk about these health effects, right? Like whether it's from wildfires or the various different aspects of what climate disasters can bring.
Yeah, I would argue that we're all vulnerable in the end. But certainly in the near term, the places that are most vulnerable, indigenous communities, of course, are right on the front lines, especially out throughout the boreal forest. They're in these isolated communities where the fires are annually ripping through. Coastal communities, I wouldn't be buying any oceanfront properties in Florida at any time soon. Lower socioeconomic class, we know that they just can't protect themselves. They're more exposed. They're more often having to work outside during those wildfire events, or are unable to protect themselves from those heat events. We even know that there's a gender impact, and that women are more impacted than men. And so at the moment, those are the ones that are most impacted, but eventually it's going to be all of us.
Yeah, that is a good point. I mean, at the end of the day, we will all be facing impacts of climate change and are facing impacts of climate change, but it is, you know, interesting, disappointing, frustrating, all sorts of emotions when you see the most im- uh, disenfranchised or marginalized communities, or folks in our community that are, bearing the biggest brunt right now. And to be honest, it's
Also least responsible, right? The least
that's
responsible for
exactly
what's
where I
going
was
on.
going.
And that
Absolutely.
not only within our country, but certainly on a geopolitical level, you can see that as well, with sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia being very impacted. South Asia.
Yeah, definitely. Least responsible, but unfortunately bearing the brunt of the impacts. But speaking of, as in Alberta, we're talking about responsibilities, we're talking about accountability. What are you seeing in terms of response from the oil and gas industry? Do you feel that there is some level of accountability that the industry is taking, or some of its allies are taking, for driving climate change and for, playing a role in these disasters that we're seeing and experiencing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've seen the math already in this presentation, that it's absolutely impossible for us to meet our international goals without the oil and gas sector doing its part, and yet they're not doing their part. And just a point of clarification, I remember the first time that an oil and gas emissions cap was proposed was in October 2006 by Rona Ambrose of the Harper government. So I know we're saying that it was promised in 2021, but actually we are way behind, because it was 2006, and then they never, of course, put it in place. And of course, they're very effective lobbyists. The oil and gas industry makes a ton of money, and they pay a ton of taxes into the pockets of governments, and they have a lot of employment that's associated with them. So it's a very powerful part of the Canadian establishment, and yet it's killing us in the end. And so it's a very hard. At no point have I ever seen the oil and gas companies voluntarily do the right thing. We really do need regulations, um, and carrots and sticks, all of the above, to get them to do the right thing, because they're just not going to do it out of the kindness of their heart, despite the incredible responsibility that they bear for where we're at today.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it just goes back to what Alex was sharing earlier. Like, they are pushing back against, at every levels, not just federal, not just through the media, but also on provincial levels, and speaking to, provincial leaders about pushing back against this regulation, because they don't want to reduce their own emissions, and they rather just make billions and billions of dollars and leave the rest of us holding the bag. But obviously, we can't allow that, and we do have the power to change that. Um, Thanks so much for that, Joe, and for those unique perspectives on the oil and gas industry, the impacts of pollution on communities, um, and how despite Prime Minister Trudeau promising in 2021, this has been something that activists, climate organizations, communities have been asking for. When I'm talking about when we speak about the oil and gas emissions cap for decades now. Um, so thank you for your thoughts. Next, I would invite Gretchen to share with us her perspective. And Gretchen, perhaps we can start have this conversation and focus a little bit from the part of the country you're from in Atlantic Canada. What are some of the climate impacts that Atlantic Canadians are concerned about, are facing, or expected to face as we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I see there's some folks from Atlantic Canada on the call. I'm based in Timbuktu, Halifax. So yeah, I mean, I'd say they're they're chronic, pervasive, and at times acute. So we're very fortunate not to be seeing wildfires yet in the region, and of course send so much thoughts of support for those that are being affected right now out west. But yeah, definitely last year was a year of reckoning in the place where I live, Halifax and southern Nova Scotia as well. Lots of fires, lots of smoke. Of course, coastal areas, as been mentioned earlier in this webinar, are at risk. So, we see flooding, erosion. Unfortunately, the provincial government here in Nova Scotia has declined to create a Coastal Protection Act. So we're not even doing what needs to be done to protect the coast from what we know is sea level rise and increased storms. And yeah, I mean, this is the time of year, unfortunately, that I have to start thinking about protecting my kid and my family from ticks because ticks carry Lyme disease. And there's been massive increases in the amount of Lyme disease incidents in Atlantic Canada. And we all just have to take care when we go out. I don't want to discourage people from going out. We go out in nature a lot, but you do have to take care and think about decreasing exposure. And I think Dr. Vipond, you probably have the stats better than I do, but I know between 2019 and 2018, the incidents doubled in Nova Scotia, and I'm unfortunately, I'm sure it's probably gotten worse. And in terms of wildlife and biodiversity, I think folks really do see changes around them, and in terms of the species that you see or don't see anymore. Sometimes it's interesting. I'm a bit of a birder, and we have a cardinal now in our backyard. That's actually an unusual thing, or it used to be. So there's shifts happening, and sometimes it's kind of cool to see these new species, but it also means that other species probably are not getting the chance in the habitats that they used to have. And we work closely in Sierra Club with other organizations to protect the North Atlantic right whale, and because of changing ocean temperatures, it's thought the whale shifted from being more present in the Bay of Fundy to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which is northward. And that shift, not only are species shifting where they are, it's having unintended consequences for them. So they're much more likely to be hit by ships. And there's actually a whale entangled in the Gulf right now as I speak. So not only are species changing distribution, but it's having unexpected impacts on them. And of course, as species shift, that affects our lobster and crab fisheries as well.
Yeah, I think the point that you're bringing up is so important because oftentimes, people do create a distinction between, the biodiversity decline and the species distribution and the biodiversity crisis as well with the climate change crisis. And they are so interwoven and they are so connected because as we experience warmer temperatures, drier temperatures, it does change the distribution and how these animals behave in a region where they have long been. And, I think this is a pattern that we'll continue to see is like, unless we get it right, and we do have a really good shot of getting it right, unless we're able to reduce our pollution, Canada, yes, but also globally, the impacts of climate change will compound. So I think that is a scenario, that is a future that all of us, including our elected officials, have to do everything in our power to avoid, because it's a snowball effect. Um, Going back to Atlantic Canada, though, I imagine Atlantic Canada's experience with the oil and gas industry, big oil, like many places across this country, is unique. Would you be able to share with us an example of how the oil and gas industry exerts its influence in Atlantic Canada, and whether or not that has shaped your views or your perspective on the upcoming oil and gas emissions cap policy?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I do want to preface, and I can see folks, familiar names on the call again. So I do want to say good stuff is happening out here. So I think the movements out here have stopped fracking in all four Atlantic provinces. We've stopped LNG projects through activism. And just last winter, Sierra Club and others pushed for the cancellation of new oil drilling leases on the Scotian shelf. And, that was a joint provincial federal decision, a rare point of unity when it comes to energy and inter-federal and provincial relations. And part of the reasoning for that is that there's seen to be new energy opportunities in the offshore and offshore wind. And of course, as Sierra Club, we're big proponents of local energy sources, solar and wind, that can benefit communities here. So good stuff is happening, and it can happen, and it does happen, as you said, Aly. But at the same time, we do have a pretty entrenched influence of the oil and gas industry, and I'm less familiar with, although I work with folks in New Brunswick, and I know Environmental Defense has done some great work highlighting the influence of the Irving family on economics and policy, and on particularly on the emissions cap. I won't go into that too much, but I will speak to the influence as I've seen it in Newfoundland and Labrador and in offshore oil and gas over the years. And I really encourage people to check out a book by Angela Carter called Fossilized, which talks about how oil and gas influences policy in a few provinces, but Newfoundland and Labrador is one of them that she goes over. And, you know, there's many ways that you see it, and she points out it infiltrates our institutions. So in fact, the Newfoundland and Labrador government has created a crown corporation that has a 10% stake in a new oil drilling project called Bay du Nord. So they literally are part of developing oil and gas. They also are basically supported through subsidies from government. So they secure funding. The recent Newfoundland government budget added, $13 million more to ExxonMobil's already bulging resources to explore for oil and gas off of Newfoundland and Labrador, and that's in addition to 50 million that had been put toward exploration. So subsidies. And then the oil and gas industry is very successful in influencing how it is regulated, which is very relevant to our discussion today. So in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, the actual regulator for oil and gas is populated by people who worked in the industry, and it is tasked with, and these are called the formerly offshore petroleum boards, now they're called the offshore energy boards. But they, so they're made up of oil industry folks, and then they have a mandate that's to promote the industry as well as supposedly regulate it, which from our perspective puts them de facto in a conflict of interest position. And how I've seen this work over the years is government science, which, may show, or folks like us that are highlighting concerns about the risk of an oil spill in the offshore, gets very much diminished, and to some degree ignored. And then, when we have a case like Bay du Nord, which is drilling 500 kilometers in the middle of the North Atlantic in waters deeper than a kilometer, I mean, the stakes are extremely high. And if you see government science sort of papered over and a project approved with no realistic plan to clean up a massive spill out there, you see the sort of invisible hand of deregulation at play. And we're actually actively in court now challenging Baydonor's approval, but we're also challenging a further deregulation of exploration drilling, which is a very risky phase of drilling that, again, has been successfully deregulated so that it doesn't undergo project-specific impacts assessment. So yeah, oil and gas infiltrates our institutions. It gets subsidies. It's a force for deregulation. And I guess we see it directly, just direct lobbying and advertising, as Alex mentioned. You just see it out there in terms of items on the radio, billboards, and so forth that really mislead people that they are somehow alone in thinking that climate change is the most important issue of our time, and that this industry needs to do its share. We really have to step up our game to counter those messages. But it's pretty pervasive, the influence at times.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, this is an industry that does like to exert its influence, likes to use its resources, its access to government officials at all levels, vast billions and billions of dollars of cash that they can misinform and have advertising campaigns. So sometimes it does feel like, we're fighting Goliath here. But at the end of the day, you referenced this earlier. There are stories of success, and through mobilizing, through our collective power, through our collective voices, there are successes that we can build off of. Whether they're more regional focused, provincial, or national or global. There are many stories of successes, and I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on what your experience is working with, organizations, grassroots groups on holding polluters accountable, and what have you found to be the most successful? Because I think these are, this is the way that we solve this issue.
Yes, and this is as a young marine biologist, I remember yelling at a government scientist because they were papering over the effects of seismic blasting, which is exploration. What they do to explore for oil and gas under the ocean floor, and just having the sort of the veil lifted on how science even gets used in these scenarios to justify expansion. And I guess I would say key to that is knowing you are not alone in wanting better and seeing the truth. I think is really, really key. And just I think that helps with climate anxiety, as it has been mentioned, but I think just it also gives you some, like, when you hear those ads on the radio, it's like, actually, no, we're not going to freeze in the dark. We'll be okay if we switch to wind and solar. And in fact, these folks are taking all their profits and not doing anything about this problem. So you are not alone in seeing this injustice, and there are folks out there who want to back you up. So that's one. And then the four other things I'd say is working in coalitions. I mean, so great to be on this webinar with you folks and with, CAPE. And I should mention, definitely the work we've done on the emissions cap has been in broad coalition with different groups. But all of the wins that I mentioned earlier have happened in coalition with Indigenous allies, with other NGOs, with the fishing industry. So, and, support those that are at the tip of the spear and are on the front lines, whether you're an evacuee now or if you're fighting a new oil and gas, just support those that are on the front lines when you can and how you can in different ways. It doesn't mean you go to the front line. You can support in other ways. I definitely feel understanding treaty rights and obligations is very important. One of the wins we've had here was because the Grassroots Grandmothers, which is a collective of women and elders, Mi'kmaq elders, stood up to potential gas cavern on the shores of the Shubenacadie River, and they wouldn't stop, but their echoing theme was water is life, and we are treaty people and we have obligations. And they brought in so much of the community by doing that. So really understanding in a deep way what those rights mean, and being an ally to folks who are putting themselves out there, but are also really calling for others to respect nature and life. We're big proponents of the rights of nature at Sierra Club. So, just really understanding in an integral way how that is a path forward. Perseverance. Like I say, I've been doing this for quite some time. And the Liberals, it looks like the government has been promising to do this for since 2021. We're not going to give up. We're not going anywhere. We're going to get this done. But yeah, I guess the last thing I would say is paint a different picture in your mind of what's possible. Don't let them try to tell you they have to do these things a certain way in order to have a prosperous and fair society. That's why we're such big champions of energy democracy. Was just in Newfoundland on a strategy session on a just transition, and some of the most exciting times we're talking about what's possible if we did a wind co-op, or if we took control of the energy that we use in different ways and benefited from it. So painting a different vision is also really important, like mentally, but it's also like, okay, it takes that power away from those folks who say none of this is possible, because we know what's possible. We've seen it. So those are the 5 things
Absolutely.
I'd recommend.
Absolutely. And like, I really want to emphasize, the last point about taking power away, because when we look at this the oil and gas industry, or basically any sort of polluting industry, especially oil and gas in Canada, they win, or they benefit, when people aren't aware that there are other solutions, when they can use the fear, they can use the anxiety to misguide us, they can use that to distract our elected officials. But the fact of the matter is, there are other solutions available. We don't have to rely on just what this industry is saying, because at the end of the day, they're going to say whatever they can to continue making their billions and billions of dollars, to continue paying their CEOs, to continue paying their shareholders. The truth, though, is that we have other options available, and it is so important that we can then take that power away and then build it within the community. We can build it within the people, the masses, the folks that are on the front line, the organizations that are working, the indigenous communities. There's a way to kind of shift the narrative and tilt it in our favor, and I think all three of our panelists today touched on that in various different ways. So I do want to thank you, Gretchen, for that. That was incredible. Um, One question, and unfortunately, Alex, I believe, had to leave because of the conference that she was attending. So she sends her regrets. A question for both you, Gretchen and Joe. In your own words, and we'll maybe do it in a minute or two, because then we do want to get into the questions from our audience here. In your own words, could you speak to why this emissions cap, this policy, is such an important climate policy for Canada? And
Well, I mean,
go for it.
for me, it's partly fairness and partly math. I mean, it's important from a math perspective because it's just absolutely impossible for us to achieve our emissions. And I think it's also worthwhile mentioning from a math and fairness perspective that if you actually look at where the oil is made, it's in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And if we aren't going to reduce our emissions in our 2 provinces because of this one industry, that means everybody else has to do a massive amount of more work in order to achieve our emissions or targets, or we just throw up our hands and say we can't do it. And I don't think the latter is really a responsible, fair, or honorable way of dealing with the climate crisis. So that means we need to do our part out here in the prairies.
Thank you for that. Gretchen, over to you.
Yes, and I would just echo that fairness piece. I mean, if you're fortunate to live in a neighborhood like I do, there are people putting solar panels up, they're putting in heat pumps, they're insulating their houses, they're investing in an EV if they can. there's lots of steps folks are taking every day to tackle this crisis and do better for the future. And it really is not fair that the most polluting industry in this country is going to and the source of the problem is going to skate through this and try to use their lobbying power to elude responsibility. And just in a very concrete way, where I work with offshore oil and gas quite a bit, and I've sort of pointed out how it is regulated by these offshore boards here in Atlantic Canada, in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. Without this type of regulation, there really will be no concrete way to hold industry to account. And Newfoundland plans to double its oil production by 2030. Let's hope those ambitions are not realized. But and they're already incentivizing, as I've mentioned, new exploration for oil and gas. If exploration drilling occurs at the level that they anticipate, that itself will make Newfoundland and Labrador's emissions targets, the emissions from the drilling, not the oil that comes out and gets burned, will make those targets unattainable. So a regulation like this is really, really important because we've seen this history of permissive regulation at the provincial level. For oil and gas to call that to account and ensure that these developments are happening in line with targets and we can actually achieve them. But I think overall it's just so unfair that this industry that is the source of the climate crisis is trying to pull a fast one here.
And what's amazing, it's not just Newfoundland that wants to expand their production. It's Dubai and Saudi Arabia and the United States of America and Alberta and Saskatchewan. So, we say that we want to actually, as a species, prevent civilizational collapse, but these particular industries don't seem to share our interest in saving ourselves.
Yeah, and that's where we come in, right? Putting that pressure. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that. Let's jump into some questions from our audience over the next 8 minutes or so. One question that came up was, what is the most impactful way for individuals to put more pressure on industry and government for accountability and transparency? And that is open for both of you.
I would maybe I'll start just because I'm unmuted. I would just say that this is a political fight, and politics and lobbying for what's right involves getting your hands dirty. And people have two valuable things that they can share. They either have time, which involves volunteering, or they have money, which involves supporting organizations that are already doing the work. So get involved in the small p political ways, and if you want, in the big P political ways, because that's how we make change. When you look at the big scheme of things, they have power and money, and all we have is truth and people. So we just need to make sure that the truth and people are mobilized to the best efforts so that it overpowers what they have.
That's a really good point. Absolutely. Gretchen, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, exactly. We do have power in people, and I think for this particular issue, we're going to be championing and hosting some town halls in Atlantic Canada. So folks who are dialing in from the region, hope you can join us, because I do think there have been real efforts to kind of paint climate action as somehow anti even democratic, which is or somehow we can't afford climate action, when in fact climate action is done correctly can save people a lot of money and actually will save the planet as well. So it's a double win-win. So so the town halls are meant to bring people out to talk about how we're feeling with this, as has been mentioned, wildfires are starting, so this is a time of anxiety and fear, but let's bring people out, let's let's really build community, and let's work together to pressure for this really vital policy to get passed as soon as possible, and for it to be as strong as it should be. So yeah, so we're hoping we're going to be doing some face-to-face organizing in the region. I think that's really possible. And then I guess secondarily, just walking the walk and talking the talk is really, really important outside of the political realm. So taking part in initiatives that are alternative energy in any ways that you can, and we know that right now, because our channels of communication are very siloed, there probably are people in your circles that may not think that this is that important, or that actually have been convinced that somehow climate action is not in line with their best interests. And speaking one-on-one to friends and family about climate change and the hope, as well as the fear, is really important. And we've got some cool podcasts on that, and how to talk to friends and family, because that is, people in your circle are the people that you trust the most. And it's a way to break through some of the silos that are happening in our different media channels as well. So those would be, in addition to definitely giving time and money, and donating to good groups like Environmental Defense, and of course Sierra Club as well. So it's really important.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that is really important. We have quite a few questions about carbon capture from our audience, and the gist of those questions are: is carbon capture a viable option? Does it work? Can it solve the climate crisis? And I want to just pass that on to you folks first, and then I would like an opportunity to speak on that as well. So if you want to go for it first, Joe.
Yeah, we have an hour, right? We have 2 hours, 3 hours, because
We got a few minutes.
so there are
Oh,
two
boy.
carbon capture and storage plants right now in Canada. One is the Boundary Dam coal plant, which has never achieved its targets, is quite expensive, and the Saskatchewan government has decided against putting in another unit, putting in CCS on the adjacent unit, because it's just not economical and it's not working like it's supposed to. Quest is another one, which is been going for a while, doing okay, but still only, I think it's something like 57% of its emissions, or less than 50% of its emissions are being captured by design. But it also shows that this is like really hard to do. Just this week, or last week, Capital Power decided they were not going to put carbon capture and storage in on its new natural gas plant, and so CCS has always been a little bit of overpromise, underdeliver, and we're seeing that again here in the oil sands. They have not put a shovel into the ground for their promised CCS unit that's supposed to be functioning in 6 years. It'll never be functioning in 6 years. And I think it's really important to recognize that they want to do this on your dime, on the taxpayer's dime, and they don't want to do it despite the billions of dollars coming into their coffers. They want the government, and they call it de-risking, right? They want to de-risk the project. It means they want somebody else to pay for it because it's too risky for them to put their dollars behind it. So anyways, we could go on and on. We don't have a lot of time left, but
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that, you're absolutely right. This is another distraction that the oil and gas industry is trying to sell us as being the solution. And in the report that was referenced by Alex earlier, the greenhouse gas emissions report from the Environment and Climate Change Canada, there was a stat which I found not surprising, but I feel like it might shock a few people that feel like carbon capture is a technology that can work. Since 2000, the amount of carbon that has been captured by carbon capture technology is 0.0004% of Canada's emissions, and we are sinking in billions and billions of dollars, or at least the industry is asking for billions and billions of dollars of our money, of taxpayer money, that could go towards actual proven solutions. But here they are telling us that this is that trick that is gonna help solve all the problems, but it's all lies. I don't know, Gretchen, if you want to add something. We do have only a minute left. It's been an amazing discussion.
lies is a good way to end it. But, I guess I would also say if you look at the price of renewables right now and energy storage and energy efficiency, like it just doesn't add up that we're going to keep investing in carbon capture storage. If those folks want to risk it that are in the fossil fuel industry, that's fine. But yeah, to be risking collective resources that should be put elsewhere seems so wasteful. And yeah, I think the proof is in the pudding there. In terms of that number, it's like
Absolutely. It's
shockingly
a
low.
spend your own
It's a
money.
dangerous distraction from the shift we need to see. Yeah.
Absolutely. They can spend their own money, not, money that can actually help solve the climate crisis. That does bring us to the end of our time today. Thank you so much for everyone joining us. For any of the questions that we weren't able to get to, we will be responding to them in an email with the recording link and circulating it to everyone that registered. We will also be compiling some of the resources that were referenced in this call, the podcast, the reports, the framework, if folks are interested in diving in a little bit deeper on the technical side of things for this policy. Special shout out, special thank you for to all the speakers for their insights and reflections on this important policy and the importance of making sure that the emissions cap continues to move forward within our climate journey. I want to also take a moment to say thank you to all our supporters tuning in for today's webinar. It is absolutely encouraging, despite sometimes the anxiety that we face, to see so many of you taking action and attending this webinar to protect our environment. And if you are feeling inspired, I referenced, a call is worth 1,000 petitions to our elected officials. It's a fact. So we do encourage you to call your local MP and tell them why you want to see a strong emissions cap. The link can be provided in the email. It is also in the chat. So feel free. We have a script. You can follow along and ensure that your elected officials know that their constituency members, the people that they represent, they care for the emissions cap and they want to see it. Stay tuned for the recording of this webinar and for more ways to take action. If you want to stay in touch, you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook at EnviroDefense on all. And you can also reach out to us by email. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.